second phase of an EPM project is requirements gathering, and what we also call scope validation. So we start off with an expectation of what the scope will be, what the timeline will be. But you want to talk a little bit about that. What have you noticed in requirements gathering? Because it's still very early on in the discussions. What have you noticed to be key in order to make sure there's a successful phase and we get sign off on requirements from the business and the technical team?
Depending on the product being implemented, you may even need IT or financial systems to inform of the current data transformations that users may not be aware of. To keep in mind, anytime data goes from one system to another, there may be some data transformations that the end user may not always see or be informed of. And so, in addition to SMEs, you may need IT and financial systems. But one concern would be that if the team is a newer team and not familiar with the company or the comprehensive end-to-end process, that could be an area that could represent a challenge. What do you see as ways to get around some of that?
That's a good point, because that's not something in anybody's control. And so I think executive alignment is extremely important at all phases of the project. We typically start off with the expectation that executives are aligned with the objectives, and there are people that have some of that legacy knowledge of the applications and processes. And then there are folks that and it may not be the same people that understand the vision that we're trying to execute on with the customer. So I think always validating those objectives so that we don't lose sight of the big picture, because some of these requirements can get pretty nitty gritty. I mean, you're talking about data integrations, you're talking about planning and budgeting, financial close, account recs, and they get down to a very low level of detail. But I think always bubbling up the discussion to say, hey, are we meeting the company's overall objectives to maybe reduce the time to close, to get transparency in reporting? And then you mentioned technical teams. So maybe one of the objectives is I want to spend less time, you've been in this role, maintaining accounts, maintaining entities. And oh, wow, now we have 4 applications. And if I have to make that change 4 times, am I really meeting a requirement of being more efficient and having a single source of truth? And so there are many different objectives, but I think it's always key to continue to revisit the big picture as you go down that path of requirements.
And that's a really good point. So do you have ways of measuring the success with the customer?
Yeah, so there's an increased focus on benchmarks and metrics. So one of the things we look at is the priority and the level of effort. So there may be things that give the customer a bigger bang for their buck within the time and budget allocated, right? And so we like to focus on those and the alignment with the vision and objectives. But then there may be things that are phased out as enhancements because we've come to realize that they're a lower priority and a high level of effort. And so while there might be value in the future, they get, deprioritized. So we start to rank all of the requirements. And then we also start to see where we can leverage Oracle's pre-built frameworks versus a necessary customization. So is something configurable or there's a necessary customization that is required? And then at the end of the day, we make sure we balance all of that up against the scope and the timeline, right? To make sure there is control of scope creep. And then there's a way to creatively address some of these things. Maybe we collaborate with the customer, for instance, on reporting, so there's different checks along the ways and different, I would say, rankings of requirements that help us make sure that we are still adding the most value in the time allocated for that phase.
And what you're mentioning about, prioritization is so important from a client perspective, because when a client is giving requirements, they think everything's important. And by putting those parameters around prioritization and maybe phasing, that really makes the client think, okay, is this really needed at this point, or is this a nice to have and we can do it at a future phase?
Absolutely. So even in our methodology of, how we implement or do customer road mapping, crawl, walk, run, fly. So we're happy to share what other customers have done on that journey to give a client a perspective that, hey, this is something that, you guys can be self-sufficient on this process or this application and enhance down the road, or engage help in. And we see that very often because we know resources are limited on projects, and we want to definitely make the best use of them.